Bonjour, good morning, Burada and Dematit. You may have heard that there are many links between Brittany and Wales in terms of culture, in terms of history, and quite interestingly, in terms of language. So today I've travelled to Carnac to explore that a little bit further. So the first question has to be, what evidence is there for any links at all between the Welsh and the Bretons?
Let's start with the basics. If you've ever learned to count in Welsh, you'd be delighted to learn that you can also count in Breton, as the numbers 1 through to 10 are pretty much identical. Even if you strip out Latin-derived numbers from 1 to 3, which are pretty much the same in all Western European languages, numbers like pedwar, pimp, chwaith and saith are quite unique. But it doesn't just end there. There is a host of words that we have in common across both languages. And if you take into consideration words that may not be written exactly the same, but are pronounced exactly the same, so it extends beyond. And these aren't just words that are modern words like internet and television, or words that are, again, derived from Latin like pont for bridge or fenestra for window. These are fairly unique words shared by both languages. And it doesn't just end with shared vocabulary for common words. It also extends to place names. This is the medieval town of Van in southern Brittany. Now, Van is its French name. Prior to being called that, it had a different name, its Breton name. Now, the Breton name for this city is Gwynedd, which may sound familiar. So I guess the logical question at this point is to ask why? Why do we have shared words in our languages, shared place names? The truth is, we have a shared history, and at several points do our histories overlap. But the first point at which they overlap is as far back as it is possible to trace.
So we're going right back into prehistory. And to put into context how far back we're talking about, the population of Britain around about this time would have been below 50. Now, I say the population of Britain, let me put some context into that. The whole idea of expecting people to be of one place in this period of history is just completely off the park. People in those days were much more nomadic. People would habitually move throughout Europe to where the weather was most favourable, where the crops could grow, where they could catch the animals to hunt. So you would quite frequently find people moving all over the place. And to point in hand, here in Carnac, where they uncovered some of the remains and artefacts and treasures that were buried alongside people in the tumuli here. They found jewellery that was clearly extracted in Spain, in the Alps, in Italy, and we find similar things elsewhere as well, which just goes to show how far and wide these people would travel, and also, of course, their aptitude for trade.
We believe that the people of the Neolithic period were nomads. They moved around, hunted wherever conditions suited them best at the time. The idea of settling down in one place and farming it came after the Neolithic period, around 2000 years BCE at the start of the Bronze Age. So those people who chose to live and farm in Wales would have been related to the ones who settled in Brittany. They would have all been descended from those same Neolithic nomads who built all the monumental architecture in places like Carnac, Trellick and Pentre Ifan. So, first people to settle in both Brittany and Wales around 2000 BCE would have been the descendant of these nomadic Neolithic people. But about 1,000 years later, a potential upset came in the form of some new kids on the block, the Celts. There's a common misconception that because so many Irish, Welsh, Cornish and Breton people identify as Celts, that they were the original indigenous people. They were not. Their tribal homelands were in the Austrian Alps. They became sophisticated, powerful and wealthy off the back of trading in salt. They then set about invading territories and ended up dominating most of Europe. They were, as far as we can deduce, the first Northern European superpower. It's from this period that the similarities in our two languages probably stem. According to the Roman chroniclers, there were several Celtic tribes, each with their own language. Those who spoke the Gaelic language settled in Ireland and the Isle of Man, and later pushed the Picts out of Scotland. The ones who spoke Brittonic settled in Wales, England, northern France and the Low Countries, and the ones who spoke Gaulish settled in the rest of France. These were the first wave of Germanic hordes to sweep through northern Europe in the coming millennia. Each of the subsequent ones was to leave its mark on this story. The Romans also gave us other indicators that the Celts who settled in Brittany were closely connected to those who settled in Wales. Here is, for my money at least, the most fascinating example of that. We spoke earlier about the city of Van. The name Van is derived from the name given by the Romans for the people who lived in this area of southern Brittany, a Celtic tribe called the Veneti. When the Romans came to Wales, the name they gave the people of West Wales was the Dometi. Now, phonetically very close, I'm sure you'll agree, but is that all there is to it, or were these people actually the same tribe, separated by sea? In November 2015, Sir Walter Bodmer of Oxford University and Professor Peter Donnelly of the Wellcome Trust for Human Genetics conducted a study in which blood samples from 4,500 people across the various regions of the UK were compared against samples of DNA of 6,000 Europeans to map out ancestral patterns across the United Kingdom. It threw up some unexpected curveballs. It showed beyond doubt that Celts were not a single tribe, but a multitude of genetically different tribes who came together. It also demonstrated that people from North Wales were not genetically matched to people from South Wales. It also set out a finding that the people of South Wales were more closely related to the Neolithic settlers from Carnac than any other group. My theory, therefore, that the Veneti and the Dometi are actually the same tribe is not yet proven, but there is at least some contemporary genetic indicators that it could be true. After the Romans left in the 5th and 6th centuries, there was a period of a lot of movement and displacement across Europe, and it saw a lot of two-way traffic between Wales, Cornwall and Brittany. Part of the reason was because of those Germanic hordes sweeping across Europe, the Saxons moving across to take England, and the Franks moving across to take most of what was Gaul.
Because, of course, the Saxons never successfully invaded Wales. No. We Welsh gave Fritz a jolly good spanking on that occasion and sent him home packing.
And the Bretons managed to achieve something broadly similar when it came to the Franks, and it was this isolation of these two areas that led to a lot of cooperation between them. But the biggest bond that they had was not down to war. It was down to something altogether newer.
Something that, as it turns out, was going to become quite a big thing. Christianity. There was quite a north-south divide in Europe in the 5th and 6th century. The area around the Mediterranean, south of the Alps, was very sophisticated, was full of art, culture, and philosophy. The area north of the Alps, well, that was altogether a much more muddy place, where there was not so much going on besides fighting and drinking beer. Oh, how things have changed.
So when Christianity was starting to spread out of the Mediterranean area and into northern parts of Europe, it was spreading in pockets, and those pockets were isolated and operating in silos, and there was a general feeling that this wasn't particularly healthy, particularly when second and third generation Christians were sort of losing the initial message and were blending their faith with that of pagan religions of the people who were around them. The church recognised this was potentially a massive problem, so they called on a bishop from Burgundy, a chap by the name of Saint Germanus, of Auxerre, and his job was to try and find a way of standardising how scripture was taught and implemented across Northern Europe. And his vision was picked up no more than 40 to 50 years after his death by quite an unlikely source. It was a Breton prince, royal descent, who in earlier life had been a warrior knight, but who had chosen to lay down his sword and shield and instead become a man of the church. His name was Illtyd, and he described himself as a disciple of St. Germanus, and he wanted to complete St. Germanus's vision by establishing a place of learning, where the true orthodox scriptures could be taught and where priests and bishops and monks and missionaries could go to learn how to spread the word of God. Now, being a Breton prince, where do you suppose he chose to locate this school? Metz, maybe, or Mont-Saint-Michel, or Nantes? No, obviously he chose Llantwit Major in South Wales. It's difficult to overstate the importance of the school at Llantwit Fawr to the ties between Wales and Brittany, and to the church in early medieval Europe generally. It was the first university ever established in Britain, and quite possibly the first in Northern Europe. It drew in the sons of the royal households from right the way across the continent, and its alumni is a bona fide who's who of ecclesiastical heavyweights. From Brittany, people like Saint Paul de Leon and Saint Samson of Dol came to study here before returning home to establish their own ministries. And as you would expect, with the college being on Welsh soil, an abundance of homegrown talent also came to study there, before taking their learning to establish churches right the way across Europe. St. Patrick and St. Finian both studied at Llantwit before establishing the church in Ireland. St. Petroc took his mission from Llantwit to Cornwall, and there are those for whom one country was just not enough. St. Cadoc is well known for all the churches and institutions he founded across England and Wales. He may be most famous for establishing the Abbey in Llancarvan, but he also established many other churches in Wales, such as the two Cadocstons, the one in Barry and the one in Neath, Pentwyn near Cardiff, Llangatog in Monmouthshire, and many, many more besides. These were all Welsh ministries established by this Welsh saint, but like so many of the Llanilltyd output, he travelled to Brittany to establish churches there too. This is without doubt the most picturesque of them. The Ile de Saint-Cadeau on the Gulf de Morbihan in southern Brittany. In this place, they celebrate his Welsh roots with local place names like Plas Glamorgan, and the Welsh and Breton flags proudly hang side by side in his chapel. And Saint-Cadeau isn't just some also-ran in the Breton church hierarchy, he's credited with being one of the principal founders of the church in Brittany. In fact, 5 of the 7 saints credited with establishing the Breton church were Welsh, and 6 of the 7 were Llantwit alumni. The Chapelle de Saint-Cadeau on this island was a place of significant pilgrimage from over 1,000 years. It was believed that if you bathed in his well, you could be cured of deafness. And this is one of several churches dedicated to Saint-Cadeau in the area, along with several churches dedicated to his contemporary, Welsh saint, St. Gildas the Wise, who we will talk a little more about later on. St. Tylo is an interesting one. He may well be remembered in Wales by the town of Llandilo in Carmarthenshire, where it is said he died, but he is equally remembered by 3 villages in Brittany called Llandelau. We also have an amazing legend to show for his time here. It is said that he was invited by King Bwdich II of Brittany to kill a troublesome dragon, which was terrifying the people of Plogonec in Finisterre. But rather than slaughter the beast, he subdued it, and the now tame animal lived out the rest of its days tied to a rocky island off the coast. To this day, the church in Plogonec is still dedicated to St. Tylo.
So, we have in common our prehistoric architecture. We have in common our ability to count to 10. We have various other words from our shared language, and of course we have this whole shared period where traffic between Wales and Brittany was toing and froing in order to further the missions of the new Christian church. There was another character who is synonymous with that period in history, and that is the character of King Arthur. Now, Up until now, this has all been quite good-natured, and we're exploring the links between what seem to be our Celtic brethren across the sea. This is where people might start to get upset. There are an awful lot of people in Brittany who believe that King Arthur was Breton, and that the legends of the Knights of the Round Table were all set in Brittany. Are they having a laugh?
So what are the arguments for and against this claim? Well, right from the start, I'm afraid that we're going to have to concede that there are a host of problems inherent with trying to prove anything conclusively about Arthur. He comes from a time when people's perception of the world around them was very different from what it is now, and unhelpfully, it was also a time when people recording events without embellishments were pretty thin on the ground. Although one exception to that was St Gildas, who we mentioned earlier. He wrote an account of the conflict between the ancient Britons and the Saxons, which to this day is still accepted as the most reliable and thorough account of the entire conflict, more than 1,500 years later. So his title of Gildas the Wise was well earned, but his presence in both Wales and Brittany does not help us with the issue in hand. To confound matters even further, images of Arthur and stories about him have been rewritten and recontemporized by a host of different people for centuries after the event. And if you want a visual example of what I mean by that, take a look at his round table hanging in Winchester, where you cannot help but notice that the image of Arthur looks remarkably similar to Henry VIII. The version of Arthur's story which most people are familiar with, the one Hollywood keeps going back to, was written by the French poet Chrétien de Troyes in the 12th century, 600 years after Arthur's death. And this reboot of the popular franchise had quite a few additions to it which had never previously been aired. All of them great stories, but none of them particularly helpful in establishing any real history, and some of the confusion is totally his fault. There are two arguments put forward to back up the claim that King Arthur was Breton. The first is that in the story of his adventures with the Knights of the Round Table, three of those knights, Sir Lancelot, Sir Geoffrey and Bors, who subsequently becomes King Bors, are all the sons of King Ban of the lost kingdom of Boinnig. And this is a kingdom in Brittany. So the logic people cling on to here is that if these three right-hand men are Breton, then maybe Arthur is Breton too. Now this theory is comparatively easy to close down because these characters were all the invention of Chrétien de Troyes, and they do not appear in any earlier versions of Arthur's story. Phew! So 1-0 to Wales then. But I'm afraid this is not an end to it.
This next theory is a little harder to palate for those of us who are rooting for the Welsh solution. There is a theory that these stories about King Arthur have been floating around in Brittany for centuries, and they only ever came to Britain as a result of the Norman invasion. Because when William the Conqueror invaded in 1066, he wasn't only armed with Norman knights and nobles, he was also armed with knights and nobles from Brittany, and 40 years later had conquered what used to be the kingdom of Morgannwg, more latterly recognised as Monmouthshire, Gwent, Glamorgan, however you describe them. A lot of the Breton nobles were rewarded for their part in the invasion by being given lands in the southeast Wales area, in particular around what we might recognise today as Monmouthshire.
So why is this significant? Well, arguably, the principal authoritative work on the life and exploits of Arthur is a book called Historia Regum Britannia, or The History of the Kings of Britain. It was published in the middle of the 12th century and was widely accepted as unequivocal historical fact for a further 500 years after that. In fact, Thomas Cromwell cited it as legal precedent to Henry VIII to give him authority to break the Church of England away from Rome. The work of Geoffrey of Monmouth. In it, he not only tells us the story of Arthur, but he gives a history of a dynasty of kings of the Britons who ruled after the Romans left. He puts some contemporary interpretation of where key events in Arthur's life happened. He has Arthur's birthplace in Tintagel in Cornwall, for example, and his court of Camelot in Caerleon in Gwent. Fun fact, because Geoffrey of Monmouth had said that Caerleon was the true site of Camelot, for many centuries after that, the people of the town believed that the remains of the Roman amphitheatre there were actually the remains of Arthur's Round Table. There is a very good reason why Geoffrey of Monmouth is part of the argument that Arthur was from Brittany, because as much as he called himself Geoffrey of Monmouth and has been widely assumed by many to have been a Welsh monk, his parents were in fact Breton. They were one of those Breton families who had settled in Monmouthshire after William the Conqueror's Norman invasion. Since this revelation was confirmed by academic heavyweight Frank Stenton of Keble College, Oxford, people have alleged that it was his family who brought the stories of Arthur with them from Brittany when they arrived in Wales, and he just regurgitated them in his book and recast them in nearby places to better appeal to his target audience.
Well, the good news for those who are rooting for Wales in all of this is that as much as Geoffrey of Monmouth may be the most widely regarded authority on King Arthur, he isn't the only one, and he is definitely not the earliest.
We have a vast wealth of Welsh folklore about him, as well as written accounts from way before Geoffrey of Monmouth. We have the Historia Britonum, the Annales Cambrea, the Godothin, Saints' Lives, the Black Book of Carmarthen, the work of Gildas the Wise, all putting Arthur in Wales. And in the case of Gildas, we also have an account of how Arthur beheaded Gildas's brother on a stone in Conwy. So the weight of evidence would suggest that Geoffrey of Monmouth learned about Arthur from his studies of Welsh manuscripts and not from the bedtime stories his parents told him. However, as I have already said, during the war against the Saxons in England and the war against the Franks in France, there was a lot of cooperation between the fellow Celtic tribes on both sides of La Manche. So it's very possible that Arthur would have spent time fighting in Brittany, Cornwall, England, the Isle of Man and Wales. And if anyone wants to try and tell me that they have conclusive proof one way or the other, I would be very sceptical. We do not even have concrete accounts of who he actually was. In most Welsh mythology and in the Saints' Lives, he was born in Wales, but Geoffrey of Monmouth has him being born in Cornwall. In the Historia Britonum, he is a 7th century character, but the Saints' Lives has him in 6th century, and everyone else thinks he's 5th century. Was he a king? Well, yes, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth and the Saints' Lives, but according to the Historia Britonum and the Annales Cambrea and a Godothin, he was a general. It's all very confusing, so I think under the circumstances, the fairest thing to do is to play nicely and share King Arthur, assuming he was a king.
So, with all of this shared history and culture taking us right back to the Stone Age, what do we have to show for it today? Well, I'm standing on the edge of a road that might be familiar to people who know Cardiff well, which is called the Boulevard de Nantes. And that road commemorates the fact that Cardiff, the capital city of Wales, has been twinned with Nantes, a major city in Brittany. But I'd like to conclude with a little anecdote, if I may, about the road which is in front of me here. When Cardiff was first twinned with Nantes and it was decided to open this street, not many people in Cardiff could speak French. So a decision was taken that the sign at the end of the street that said it was called Boulevard de Nantes should have an English translation written underneath. All was well until a little hand went up at the back of the room pointing out that Cardiff was the capital city of Wales. So if you're going to have the name written in French and in English, then you really ought to have it in Welsh as well. So things were moving ahead at pace, and then the Breton nationalists got wind of what was going on, and they said, well, hang on a minute now, if you're going to have the name of this street in French and in English and in Welsh, well, because Nantes is in Brittany, you really ought to have it in Breton as well. So the massive road sign with the place name written out 4 times in 4 different languages was duly unveiled, and everyone was feeling rather happy with themselves, until there was a glut of motoring accidents, and the trend across all of them was a claim that drivers had been distracted by trying to read a very large and complicated sign to try and work out where on earth they were. Suffice it to say, the huge road sign was duly taken down and replaced by something altogether more modest. So, what have we learned? Well, we've learned that the Welsh and the Bretons have been connected since the Stone Age, when it was the same group of nomadic Neolithic people who settled in both places. We know that when the Celts invaded Europe, it was the same tribes that occupied Wales and Brittany, and that's why an awful lot of our words and our place names are so similar. We know that after the Roman period, when the Germanic tribes of the Saxons and the Franks invaded Britain and France respectively, that both countries fought alongside each other to try and keep one another liberated, and that one of the key characters in those struggles in both countries could well have been King Arthur. And of course we have the same Christian heritage in that the churches of both countries were founded by the same missionaries, most of them educated in the school at Llantwit Major. And even today, we are still joined together by the twinning of our cities. But I think what the story about the sign tells us most is that one further thing that we have in common is that both our countries have got our fair share of nutters. And I must say, I'm delighted to be counted amongst them. I really hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope it's given you some insight into the connections between Wales and Brittany. Please subscribe to this channel, and if you don't, I will find you.